You're watching and listening to the Electronic Intifada live stream, and I'm Ali Abu Ni'meh, here with my colleague Nora Barrows-Friedman. Last week, Dawn, a US-based human rights group, filed a 172-page brief with the International Criminal Court in The Hague, urging its chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, to investigate former US President Joe Biden, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin for their accessorial roles in aiding and abetting and intentionally contributing to Israeli war crimes and crimes against humanity during the genocide in Gaza. In an article in The Nation this week, Sarah Leah Whitson, the executive director of Dawn, writes, quote, "The court has already charged the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant for committing these same crimes. Seeking the prosecution of US officials in the only global criminal court was not a decision we took lightly, particularly as the court faces threats from the United States itself." Sarah Leah Whitson previously served as director of the Middle East and North Africa division of Human Rights Watch. She's now the executive director of Dawn, a group that was founded by Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi dissident who was murdered inside his country's own consulate in Istanbul in 2018. Sarah joins us now. Sarah, welcome to the Electronic Intifada live stream.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, Sarah. Good to see you.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. Before we talk about Dawn's submission to the ICC and the investigation of Joe Biden, I just want to get your reaction to the news that broke in the last day about the United States engaging in direct talks with Hamas as efforts to try to get the ceasefire to the next phase go on. And of course, Trump's latest belligerent threats against people in Gaza. What's your quick reading of these developments?
Well, if they're true, I think it's a welcome development because it's frankly stupid and crazy to try to resolve a military conflict without talking to all sides of the conflict. And given that Hamas is obviously one side of the most recent fighting that took place, it makes sense to talk to Hamas, given that they are the ones who are agreeing with Israel to certain conditions for a ceasefire, to certain exchanges tied to a ceasefire, then it makes sense to communicate directly with them. To be honest, I would be surprised if, in fact, the Biden administration had no direct communications with them or used kind of a fig leaf of intermediaries to pretend they weren't directly communicating with them. But the idea of a prohibition on speaking to a party to the conflict when you're trying to negotiate a solution is pretty stupid. So I hope it's true.
Yeah.
Great, and we'll be talking more about that in later in the show. But in your article in The Nation, you state that you and your colleagues did not take the decision lightly to ask the ICC to investigate Joe Biden and other members of his administration. What did you have to consider, and why did you ultimately take this step? I'm sure lots of people are saying we should just focus on Trump. Why even worry about Biden now?
Well, it's actually multi-layered. There were multi-layered concerns, and making the decision to proceed with this submission and to publicize the submission was probably one of the most difficult ones I've had to make as a human rights lawyer, as a human rights activist of many decades. There were a few people, in all honesty, who didn't want us to, or advised against making any submission against US officials, for fear that it would basically weaken the ICC, increase the ammunition against the ICC, and thereby weaken the existing case against Israeli officials. And the idea was, let's go horizontal on liability. Let's add more Israeli culprits. We, of course, Dawn was the first to submit for investigation 43 Israeli defense officials, defense members of the IDF forces who were engaged in war crimes in Gaza. So we had already done that. But the idea was to add more. And I think it just boiled down to whether or not we would be doing more harm than good with this submission. There was particularly concern because of the pending bill in Congress, which came to a vote in late January, that would have imposed much worse sanctions as a matter of law, as opposed to a mere executive order, which is more easily kind of extinguished, that would sanction the court. And we didn't want publicity around our submission to actually help that vote pass. It was narrowly defeated in a filibuster. It was surprisingly defeated in a filibuster. We were pretty certain, senators were pretty certain that it was going to pass. And it didn't pass. It may come back. It's likely to come back. But at least we hope that we won't be blamed for the passage of that law, sort of adding fuel to the fire of those who want the ICC attacked, but would now have a fresh excuse to attack the ICC by saying, see, now they're going after US officials. So, and then finally, of course, was the legal liability that our organization or our staff, including myself, could be facing for doing something that breached the new executive order that Trump did issue about providing material support to a sanctioned entity or an individual. And now Karim Khan has been sanctioned by the Trump administration. I think we fortunately avoided that by making our submission privately, quietly, in January before the sanctions were issued, but publicizing it after the vote was defeated and the sanctions had already been passed. So, having to maneuver around these legal attacks on the court and the prospect of legal attacks on the court was, of great concern. And, we really were focused on what is likely to contribute to justice for the Palestinian victims and not deter from justice for Palestinian victims. And, we also consulted with at least half a dozen, if not a dozen, ICC law experts on aiding and abetting liability, on sort of strategic considerations of this kind of a submission, given the pressure the prosecutors under. And, there were definitely varying opinions, but net, the decision was to proceed. And hence we did proceed.
Well, tell us a little bit more about what you're asking the ICC to do, and what type of evidence you've gathered about Biden and Blinken and Austin. And does the International Criminal Court have a jurisdiction to act against former officials of the United States, which is, now, as you said, not a member of the ICC?
Several questions there. Let me. Now I'm not even remembering what the first one was, but
What you're asking the court to do, yeah.
Yeah, so we are asking the court under something that's called an Article 15 communication. Article 15 of the Rome Statute allows basically anyone in the world to communicate with the court, to communicate with the prosecutor, to share evidence and information, make suggestions and recommendations. And that's typically that is the vehicle through which victims or civil society groups submit evidence and information to the court. And they do significantly rely on this evidence and information, because their own investigative abilities are obviously very limited, particularly in Israel-Palestine, because Israel won't allow the court's investigators to go to Gaza or to the West Bank or to Israel in order to complete their firsthand investigations, but others are able to do that. So our submission, our Article 15 submission, urges the court to investigate these 3 U.S. officials in particular, but then I think we have about 10 additional U.S. officials who we believe bear some inquiry as well. But with these three officials, specifically to investigate them and we hope prosecute them for violating the Rome Statute, Article 25, prohibition on aiding and abetting crimes in the Rome Statute, or facilitating the commission of crimes identified as crimes in the Rome Statute. And the evidence for the role that these US officials played under the sort of jurisprudence and jurisprudential requirements of the International Court of how you prove aiding and abetting liability. It's a very high standard in the ICC. It's a very high bar. Mere knowledge that crimes are being committed is, and then providing assistance is not sufficient. There has to be direct action to assist in the commission of crimes or to facilitate the commission of crimes. And there has to be knowledge that this support will be used to facilitate the crimes. That is where we find intent, and we can deduce intent from, in addition to actual statements that they've made expressing their intent to support Israel in the commission of its crimes. So with these three officials, the evidence of these actions and intent was actually not difficult to show or to prove, nor was it difficult to show or prove that the assistance that they secured for Israel, which we include military support, political support, and public support, all played an essential role and provided essential contribution to facilitate the commission of the crimes. So the support that they authorized specifically as individuals includes not only the transfer of nearly $20 billion in military aid, and this military aid is military aid that Israeli officials and US officials have repeatedly admitted is essential to Israel to commit its crimes, that it could not carry out its military operations without such US support, including intelligence support. But it also includes the political support, namely, in particular, most significantly, the 7 UN vetoes and abstentions that President Biden ordered Ambassador Thomas Greenfield, I always switch the name of her name.
Linda Thomas Greenfield.
Linda Thomas Greenfield to make that specifically was with the purpose of prohibiting the UN Security Council from imposing a ceasefire in order to ensure that Israel could continue with its crimes.
And you also, Sarah, show in the submission, the 172-page submission, which I read when I wrote about this for the Electronic Intifada, you actually cite statements from Joe Biden himself, which show that as he was ordering and as Secretary Blinken and Secretary Lloyd Austin were facilitating the arms transfers of including these 2,000-pound bombs, that Biden stated publicly that he knew that Israel was bombing Gaza indiscriminately. He used the term indiscriminate bombing. From a legal standpoint, do those sorts of statements matter?
They matter a great deal. Intent is probably the hardest thing to show in international law, because basically you need the person to verbally declare their intention, which smarter war criminals avoid doing, and instead, mask their language more carefully to make platitudes about protecting civilians. And a lot of the writings of the US government is phrased in that kind of terminology, avoiding saying that Israel's violating the law, instead saying inane things like, we want to encourage Israel to do more to comply with the law, just ridiculous things. But occasionally, regularly and repeatedly, these kinds of acknowledgments did slip out from their mouths, again, indicating very clearly that they knew US weapons were being used to commit crimes, and having every reason to know that those crimes would continue. In addition, there is the extensive advice of their own staff, making them aware, not just in the State Department, but also in the Defense Department, making them aware that the weapons were being used in violation of US laws, making them aware that they were being used to commit crimes and atrocities. And despite the advice from their own staff, these three men intervened and interfered to ensure the unimpeded flow, over largely unimpeded flow of weapons and political support to Israel, and played a critical and essential role in facilitating the crimes.
And you call this in your submission, you refer to what's happening in Gaza as genocide. But the International Criminal Court has not indicted uh, Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant with genocide, but with war crimes and crimes against humanity, which include all sorts of horrific crimes that are part of genocide. But genocide has that extra element of intent. Are you calling for the ICC to investigate Joe Biden as an accomplice in genocide?
Yes, I mean, we absolutely are. I believe the charges against the Israelis, against the Israeli officials, Netanyahu and Gallant, who against whom arrest warrants were issued, did include a charge of genocide, but that the indictment was limited to a narrower set of crimes. Those can be added on. Additional arrest warrants could be issued for additional crimes. The court has already indicated that there are additional arrest warrants coming out. There's no limitation on, the ability of the court to add on additional crimes as circumstances arise. We have presented what I believe is the evidence to substantiate that the charge of genocide by Israelis is accurate and correct, and that the role of U.S. officials in aiding and abetting that crime is as ample as the evidence of all of the other crimes under the Rome Statute that they have been charged with. Dawn, in December of 2023, just the end of December 23, or early 24, I think, was the first organization to issue a report concluding that what's taking place in Gaza was genocide. And we reached that conclusion very quickly because the evidence is overwhelming, and it's not a numeric contest. It's a description of actions and intentions. You can, no one can die and you can find genocide, which actually recently happened in a finding of genocidal atrocities in Artsakh based purely on forced displacement. So we had a convening with genocide scholars, Holocaust scholars, international law experts, human rights experts in Gaza and Palestine. And based on that convening and the papers presented there, we did reach the conclusion that what was taking place was genocide. And, that is the contribution we think that Dawn can make, sort of being able to chime in more quickly, if not as comprehensively as Amnesty subsequently did. But I hope we contributed to normalizing the legal understanding that a genocide is being committed.
Yeah.
Mm.
Finally, we just have a couple minutes left, Sarah. So far, we've seen leaders in countries that claim to strongly support the ICC, including Germany and Poland, openly flout it by suggesting that they would welcome Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu to visit them and not arrest him. You've been working in the human rights field for many years. Do you think that the ICC and other international institutions can really be vehicles for equal justice, or are they too compromised by political interference and pressure, especially from the US?
Well, I think they're in a somewhat of a damned if we do and damned if we don't situation right now, because as I've written, over many years, since the case was submitted to the ICC, since the Palestine case was submitted to the ICC, if the ICC fails to investigate, prosecute, indict, arrest Israeli war criminals for what has been taking place since 2014, which is when the pending case goes back to, the ICC is dead. It will lose all credibility, and member states, particularly African member states, will, there'll be a massive exodus from the ICC. It will be the straw that breaks the camel's back. We've already had numerous African member states complaining bitterly about the fact that the only people they've arrested and prosecuted successfully are Black Africans. And, there's just no way that it would be tolerable or acceptable or credible for the court to fail to prosecute basically anyone allied with the United States or Western powers. So if they fail to do this, if they do allow political interference in pursuing this case, the court is finished. The court is over. This is the test for the case, just like the test for so many other things in our country, whether it's free speech or freedom of association or freedom to protest. This is this is the case. Either you allow this or your protections don't mean anything. But now we see that for certain Western states like Germany, and obviously like the United States, they are willing to try to destroy the court if it takes on Israel. So this is really a question for the international community. Are you going to burn down the court because it's prosecuting Israeli war criminals? That's a test. And, if they are, then, the court was never worth its name anyway. So so be it, but this is the test. This is the test for the court. I would say, impressed with the prosecutor and the fact that he did proceed despite the overwhelming pressure against him. I think he was much slower to act than I wish he was. I think he could have acted before the Gaza war on, the war crimes of settlements, for example. He had ample opportunity. But it is also important that when push has come to shove, he did act. He did seek additional backing for the issuance of the arrest warrants with this made-up advisory committee. That's okay. But now, of course, they're trying to bring him down with, drumming up allegations, personal allegations against him. But yeah, the survival of the International Criminal Court is on the line.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you, Sarah. We are glad to see you pushing. I mean, people are skeptical of these institutions, I think, for good reason, but I think it's right to put them to the test. And if they fail, it won't be because people did not try to use them as they were intended. And we hope to have you come back and update us on what happens and perhaps other things Dawn is working on. And let's just remind people about Dawn's website. Where can they find out more about what you're doing?
Yeah, we are at dawnmena.org, MENA, and we have a newsletter. It comes out once a month. We don't bombard people too much with emails, so please do sign up. We broadly work to reform U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. So we work on Saudi Arabia, UAE, Jordan, Egypt, basically all of the abusive dictatorships and apartheid regimes that our government supports.
US backed, yes.
US backed, yeah.
Important to point out. Thank you so much, Sarah, and we really appreciate you giving us some of your time today.
Great. Thank you
Thanks,
guys for
Sarah.
all your work. And
Thank
you.
you so much.
Bye.
Thanks. Oh, and
Yeah,
a good, yeah.
we can dream about seeing Joe Biden hauled off in shackles, but I think an important point we didn't get to in the discussion, of course, there's always so much more we can say, is that this is a point that Dawn makes in its materials, is that this is, of course, accountability is important, holding these individuals to account, but this is also about deterring future criminality when even US officials say that there is at least a potential for them to be held accountable in this way. So I'm glad to see this happening.
Yeah. As always, Palestine is the test.